Hello, everybody. We'll just get started in just a second as we're continuing to let people in. Lindsay, you probably want to introduce or say hello to everybody because they don't even know who I am.
Hi guys, my name is Miss Lindsay. I am a college and career technician, and today we have Mark giving us a presentation, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks. I am going to get everything set up here on my end. And let's see here. Let's see here. I'm going to get the Zoom up here in a second. Lindsay, I'm going to need 2 seconds, okay?
Sounds good.
All right. All right, now almost ready. Okay, can you see my screen now, Lindsay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for your patience as we get a little bit of the text sorted out here. We've got multiple interpreters, and we'll show you a little bit about how that sets up in just a second. But I want to introduce myself. My name is Mark Salisbury, and I'm going to give a presentation today that we're calling Solving the Mystery of the Financial Aid System. To talk very quickly about how the interpretation opportunities work, if you look down at the bottom of your Zoom panel, you'll see that there's an option called interpretation. If you click on that, you'll see the option to listen to this presentation in Spanish, Mandarin, or Cantonese. And I want to thank our interpreters very much for joining us tonight. I'll give you just a second to do that. Our agenda tonight looks like this. First, it's important that everyone understand a little bit about the big picture of higher education and the college admissions marketplace. Second, We will explore the different reasons that the federal government, states, and colleges and universities provide financial aid. Then we'll go a little deeper into the two primary forms that students and families must complete to access need-based financial aid, the FAFSA and the CSS profile. Fifth, no presentation on financial aid would be complete without talking about the largest piece of the financial aid pie, merit aid. And then finally, I will talk about a few ways that you can make the financial aid system work for you instead of against you. So let's start with the big picture, because it's helpful to understand a little bit about how and why the financial aid system has become what it is. Higher education in the United States is famous for not changing, no matter what is happening elsewhere in society. At the same time, society and demographics are continually shifting and changing. So what happens when that immovable object, colleges and universities, meet an unstoppable force like society itself? You get things like the American financial aid system that can often seem like it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not very logical. It doesn't always seem fair, even as the people who work in that system are trying as hard as they can to do the right thing. Yet, even if you are extremely wealthy, you will almost inevitably have to interact with some part of the financial aid system. 50 years ago, college prices were much lower, and the only financial aid that was ever given to anyone was provided because that individual was clearly very special intellectually and simply could not afford the cost of college. But those days are long gone. Today, college admissions operates in a marketplace that looks very similar to every other capitalist marketplace. There are three rules that dictate how higher education operates in that marketplace: supply, demand, and image. And over the past 50 years, the financial aid system has evolved to fit in with that marketplace. It's very important to understand that a lot of the financial aid system is no longer designed to be altruistic or even fair. Let's talk about the three different reasons, the logic, if you will, behind why financial aid gets awarded to students. Like a lot of things, different circumstances produce different realities. And one big difference significantly influences how different colleges and universities approach financial aid. That difference has to do with the old economic principle of supply and demand. At some colleges, there are way more applicants, more students who want to attend that college than there are seats in classrooms or beds in the dorms at that college. There is way more demand than there is supply. But at most colleges, it's the other way around. There are more seats in classrooms and beds in dorms than there are prospective students that want to enroll. There is more supply than there is demand. Each of these realities changes the way that these colleges make use of the financial aid system. And yes, if you noticed, I said make use of the financial aid system, because this system is something that colleges use to accomplish their goals regarding enrollment and student population. There are three different kinds of logic that the federal government, states, private organizations, and colleges and universities use to award financial aid. Need, meaning that the student doesn't have the money to pay the price that the college is charging, has financial need. Often you'll hear people call these kinds of financial aid grants. Merit, meaning that student has some particular skill, characteristics, or ability that the college decides to reward with some kind of financial aid. Often you will hear people call this kind of financial aid scholarships. And the coupon combo. This isn't a formal name for any kind of financial aid. Instead, this is the way that a lot of colleges and universities actually operate. When you read the descriptions of the different financial aid awards that they give to students, you will notice that the descriptions are sort of vague, and they include a lot of words like may and could and up to or no less than. What is going on here is that the college knows that they need to give a lot of their applicants generous financial aid awards that turn out to be some combination of need and merit. This college knows that very few people are willing to pay the price that college has advertised. So the college has a team of consultants that figure out what amount of financial aid is necessary to get students to enroll at their school. Let's talk a little bit more about need-based financial aid. Your level of need is based on an assessment of your financial circumstances that requires you to report a lot of details about your financial situation. But one thing that matters a lot is who assesses your financial situation and determines what kind of need you have. Guess what? It's not you who gets to make that determination. Another thing to know is that different entities that award financial aid, public organizations like the state or federal government, and private organizations like colleges and universities, have different formulas and different standards for what they think qualifies as financial need. A prime example of this behavior is represented in what forms are used to collect your financial information. The FAFSA or the CSS profile are very different and are mostly used by very different kinds of colleges and universities. There are even a few schools that use their own set of forms. Merit-based financial aid, is quite different from need-based aid. While need-based aid focuses on what a student and family does not have, merit aid focuses on skills, abilities, or characteristics that a student has an unusual amount of. The most common type of merit aid is awarded to students that show a certain level of academic achievement. But there's a lot of merit aid that is awarded because of an individual's talent in the arts, in sports, in community involvement, or even because of unique accomplishments. The critical thing to know here is that just like need-based aid, every college approaches merit aid differently. Your student might be offered thousands of dollars in financial aid for achieving a certain GPA by one college, while another college doesn't offer your student a dime for earning that same GPA. The coupon combo of financial aid, again, it's not really a specific kind of financial aid, but it's worth knowing how to recognize when a college takes this approach, because it will tell you something about the kind of negotiating power you might have with that college if you decide to consider them seriously. Some colleges have scholarships that they actually award to every single new student. Everyone is special and unique. For example, there are several public universities in Michigan and Illinois that give out-of-state students the same scholarship that equals the difference between the in-state and out-of-state costs, and they give it to everyone. Some colleges send out lots of mail to try to attract more applicants by telling the student in that letter that based on your academic accomplishments, you have already been accepted and have been awarded a scholarship worth thousands of dollars. When you see these kinds of solicitations, these are perfect examples of the coupon combo. At many private colleges, giving away lots of financial aid is central to their strategy. I'll talk more about that in a little bit later. So let's talk more about the two forms that are used. There are two forms that are used by many organizations to gather financial information and assess eligibility for financial aid. The first is the one you are most likely to have heard about, especially this year, since it's in the midst of being revised and won't be released until sometime in December. The FAFSA, pronounced just like it looks, and it stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. The FAFSA is run by the United States Department of Education and has been around for decades. But in 2020, Congress passed a major revision, and the Department of Education has been scrambling to put all of those new changes in place for the last 3 years. The FAFSA is used by the federal government to determine eligibility for Pell Grants and other federal financial aid. Almost every state also has some kind of need-based financial aid program that uses the FAFSA as well. California is a perfect example of that. In addition, many colleges like to use the FAFSA results to make an evaluation of a student's ability to pay for college, and in some cases, even award financial aid. If you or your student are a senior in high school this year, then you are one of the lucky ones that get to be one of the first to use the new FAFSA. Now, fortunately, Federal Student Aid has a channel on YouTube, and they have been putting together a great set of mini tutorial videos for every step you need to complete for the FAFSA. The formula that the FAFSA uses to assess families' financial situation focuses on 3 things. Number 1, the number of individuals in a household. This could be family members, but it could also include individuals who are not immediate family members. The adjusted gross income of the parents, and in some cases, the student. In most cases, adjusted gross income is going to be pretty close to your total income. And finally, the savings and assets of the parent or parents and the student. And that primarily includes the items I listed below. Now, the FAFSA also ignores some things. Retirement plans and financial instruments designed or designated for retirement. That includes things like 401ks, IRAs, and pensions. But just note, this doesn't mean that you can have an investment portfolio or a bunch of real estate investments and just call them your retirement. On the FAFSA, you don't count the value of your primary residence. And if your student is the designated beneficiary of a college savings plan owned by someone other than parents or siblings, that doesn't get reported on the new FAFSA. Finally, if the student's parents are divorced or legally separated, then only one parent, the parent that provided more financial support in the last 12 months, gets counted in terms of income, savings, and assets. Once you've entered all the necessary data, the FAFSA formula will produce a number that is called the Student Aid Index. If you hear anyone talking about something called the expected family contribution, that's the old name for what is now called the Student Aid Index. In addition to determining if your student qualifies for a Pell Grant or one of the many state grants that use the FAFSA, completing the FAFSA is the one thing you have to do to get access to the federal student loan system. So even if you figure out that you won't qualify for any need-based grants, if there is any chance that your student might need to borrow to go to college, you should absolutely complete the FAFSA. After all, the federal student loans are by far the best student loans available. It's also important to know that part of completing the FAFSA is sending your FAFSA results to the college or colleges that you are considering. This is where it can get tricky because there are some less common financial situations where the FAFSA will wrongly suggest that the family has a lot more money than they actually have. So if your situation is unique, you really should speak to your counselor to talk through your options. Most important, even though the FAFSA is not available yet for seniors, and especially for those of you who might have a student who's a couple years away from college admissions process, find out what your FAFSA results are going to be now, long before you actually fill it out. The federal government has a student aid index estimator. I've put the URL right here on the slide. And there are several other SAI estimators on the internet that are quite good. Now let's talk about the CSS profile. That stands for College Scholarship Service. It's the other major form that's used to help some colleges determine if and how much need to award students in need-based financial aid. Although there are only about 200 colleges and universities that use the CSS profile, those colleges and universities are all of the most well-known, name brand, most selective schools. Although a small minority of colleges use the form, it has a major influence in college admissions. So if your student is hoping to attend any of the more selective colleges and universities, institutions like Stanford or Harvard, or the University of Southern California, or the University of Denver, or even Colorado College or Occidental College, you will have to complete the CSS profile. There are a couple of important differences between the FAFSA and the CSS profile that you really need to know. First, it's not part of the federal government program. It's a private entity and doesn't have to play by the same rules as the FAFSA. Second, it was started by a smaller group of very selective old money colleges, names that you've heard of, especially out east. And even though it's now administered by the College Board, the same folks who brought you the SAT and AP tests, those colleges that were part of that core group of founders still have a lot of influence over it. Unlike the FAFSA, that only asks for certain types of information about your family finances, the CSS profile asks you about every part of your financial situation. In addition, you often will be required to upload all of your financial documents after completing the form so that the folks reviewing the information will have the ability to verify that it's correct. It's so important to understand that the goal of the CSS profile is to give the college all the power to determine the price that they believe they can charge you. The colleges will say that their goal is gathering this much information is to make sure that they're fair and that students who deserve the most financial aid get it. But what they don't tell you is that they are also in the business of making money, which means charging as much as they can charge students from different economic situations and still fill their classes. This is not to say that colleges and universities that use the CSS profile are evil or somehow worse than colleges that use the FAFSA. Instead, I say all this just to emphasize to you that these colleges, these schools gather all this data so they can dictate to you the price that they want you to pay and then be able to make a complex argument about why they think that you can pay the price that they charge you. Their argument will almost certainly conflict with your logic if you disagree with how much you think you can pay. So now that I've scared you a little bit about the schools that use the CSS profile, please understand a very important point. If you are a lower income family and that is interested in schools that use the CSS profile, you'll often see even more clearly, they will see, because they've used the profile, even more clearly the amount of financial need that you have, and they will be able to give you a fantastic aid package that makes enrolling at that school affordable, oftentimes very affordable. And if you're a family that has a tremendous amount of debt, schools that use the CSS profile will see that information and may very well take it into consideration, in a way that the FAFSA does not. But for everyone else, middle income, middle upper income, and upper income families, please understand that schools that use the CSS profile are using it in order to be able to justify asking you to pay most or all of the sticker price. You won't be able to get those schools to offer you a generous financial aid package just because you don't want to pay the price they're asking you to pay. If you are not a low-income family based on Pell Grant eligibility standards, understand that the CSS profile schools will expect you to pay a substantial portion of their price. Now, everything that I've said and I've talked about so far has really just been about need-based financial aid. And although that part of the financial aid system gets the most attention, it actually makes up only a small part of the whole financial aid system. The majority of financial aid awarded every year is in the form of scholarships given out based on a student's merit. The idea that the student deserves some sort of award because they have a special skill or talent. That's why I'm calling this the merit aid monster. How did merit aid become the biggest part of the financial aid system? Well, it started with private colleges about 50 years ago, when they started to adopt a new philosophy in setting their prices. This approach is now practiced by public institutions in setting their prices for out-of-state students. That philosophy is based on the idea that setting an artificially high sticker price, one that would seem oddly high, but then following it by offering generous scholarships in the form of merit scholarships to as many students as it takes to get them to enroll. It's all built on a key aspect of human behavior. People often have a hard time comparing different items in a market where there are lots of options. In that situation, a lot of people tend to defer to price as the indicator of quality. And the way that college admissions works is that it's a multiple stage process. Students have to choose a set of schools to apply to, then they get accepted to some of those schools, and then they decide. So if a college can get more students to apply to their school, that means that those students won't apply to at least some of their competitors. After accepting those applicants, that's when the college can seduce students and families that they want with scholarships and generous aid packages. The key here is that the colleges have to get the students to apply in order to wow them with scholarships. Those scholarships and financial aid, private colleges perfected the art of getting students to select the schools that they applied to based on the belief that the more expensive school must also be a better college. Then those colleges would shower the ones they accepted with scholarships and financial aid to signal how special the colleges thought those students were. This approach turned out to work amazingly well, and pretty soon an industry-wide arms race had been launched to set your price higher than your competitor, and then tell the public that your higher price was proof that your institution was better. As I mentioned earlier, today there's far more aid awarded based on merit than there is aid based on need, and that's because of this system. But the trick here is one of distraction, one of misdirection. Get the students and families to swoon over the size of the scholarship and just how special the college says that you are, and never pay attention to how much you actually end up paying because of that crazy high sticker price. But there's a flip side to this trick, however. For a variety of reasons, most colleges and universities have gotten themselves into a situation where they have to give out lots of merit aid to everyone just to get enough students. That means that there are many places where a family that wouldn't qualify for very much need-based aid will be awarded a lot of merit aid. So for most middle income and middle upper income families that don't have the funds to pay the full sticker price or pay what the college's CSS profile formula would say that they should be able to pay, the prices that fit their price range are at the colleges that give out lots of merit aid and have given up on giving much need-based aid. All of this insight into how the American financial aid system actually works might have been a little bit overwhelming today. So remember, this video will be available for you to go back and check out any section that you might want to view again. There are definitely ways to make this system work for you and ways to get trapped by the system. In this last section of tonight's webinar, I'm going to share a few strategies that you can apply as you go through the college search and admissions process. Strategies are going to differ depending on your family income. But no matter who you are or what your situation is, remember this. Don't start looking at colleges at all until you've figured out what your price range should be. In other words, you need to start by looking at your own circumstances and your students' goals to figure out what you have to spend on college without going into a lot of debt. It doesn't matter if that number is very high or very low, because a student can earn a college degree at every single price range. What's important is that you answer the question of what your price range is first, before you look at colleges. This will ensure that you are looking at colleges that will work for you. There's just no point in looking at a college that will try to charge you far more than you should spend. Before we talk about the different ways that families from different financial situations should approach this process, let's start with two big things that matter for everyone. First, there are a lot of organizations out there that will try to tell you that you need to spend lots of money to position yourself to qualify for lots of need-based aid. In almost every single case, those are scams that you should stay far away from, because you don't even know if you'll end up considering a college that awards aid based on need or merit or some combination. These organizations use fear to try to entice you into buying expensive financial products. Don't fall for it. Second, you can go online and find lots of lists of colleges that give out the most merit aid. Those sites might be fun to click on and read, but they will likely be a big waste of time for you. Why? Because you want to know the colleges that will give you a price in your price range. And just because a college gives out lots of merit aid in total doesn't mean that they will give you a lot of merit aid. There are several good sites that can help you figure out whether a college will likely be in your price range or not, and I'll mention those later. Now, for low-income families, families that qualify for some level of Pell Grant, in many states, there's additional need-based financial aid that uses the FAFSA to determine eligibility. Unfortunately, those funds are usually first come, first serve, and run out before the college admissions cycle is over. This is exactly the case in California with some of the earlier deadlines. So fill out the FAFSA as soon as you can after it becomes available, this year in particular, and ask your counselor about any additional state-based aid that you might need to complete additional applications for. The other approach that is particularly smart for families that don't have a lot to spend on college is to look seriously at two other college pathways. The first is to look seriously at the community college options that are designed to set up a smooth transfer to a four-year college. In many states, those pathways are much clearer than they used to be. The second is to really explore employer-funded tuition reimbursement programs at companies in your area. Almost half of medium and large corporations include tuition reimbursement benefits in their overall benefits package. Yes, you may have to go to college part-time for a while, but you will have someone else paying for your college. Meanwhile, you can save the money from the job to eventually go somewhere full-time and earn your degree. For middle-income families, the FAFSA will likely be important for you as well, although it could be for different reasons. You should plan on completing the FAFSA if for no other reason than because it's the only way for you to access the federal student loans. And you'll want to have that option, even if you don't end up needing them. But you shouldn't go into the FAFSA without already knowing what the result will be. This is why it's incredibly important to use a financial aid estimator, like the one at the FAFSA site or the one at another place that's called mycollegecorner.com, that will help you find out what your results will be long before you fill out the real FAFSA. In the same way that knowing your GPA is important in knowing how a college will judge your ability as a student, knowing your FAFSA result early is important because you'll want to know how a college is going to judge your financial situation. With this information, you can make sure that you don't swoon over colleges that won't fit your price range. It's also possible that there might be some simple ways to reorganize the money you do have for your students' college costs. Middle-income families should also look carefully at the other pathways to complete the first year or two of college, like community college and employer tuition reimbursement programs. Finally, the unfortunate reality for middle-income families is that they often don't qualify for most or even some of the need-based financial aid options, but they still need a lot of help, financial help, to pay for college. This is where the merit aid monster can become your friend. Focusing on the colleges that will give your student a lot of merit aid will bring down your costs, oftentimes much more than need-based aid. For upper income families, the circumstances are different here, and I want to be careful to differentiate between folks who have enough money to pay for any college's sticker price without any worries, and the people who might have a higher income but also have a lot of expenses, or live in an area of the country where cost of living is really high. For you, it's very important to know what your FAFSA results will be before you actually complete the FAFSA. The sooner, the better. The reason you need to know this information is because colleges will make judgments about your financial situation through a lens that will tend to assume that you are wealthier than you actually are. And that can impact the way that they offer aid. And even if they offer primarily merit aid, they can offer less merit aid because they assume that you already have the money to pay for most of your students' college costs. There might also be some simple bits of advice that you can use to better organize your money for your children's college costs, but you won't know that unless you use some of these estimators early. Even more so than middle-income families, the big brand name colleges and universities, the very selective places, are going to see you as capable of paying more than you want to spend. So if you know that you have a budget or a price range that you want to stay within, then you'll want to focus on colleges and universities that offer more merit than need-based aid. You might also consider some of the alternative pathways that I just mentioned. Another strategy to consider is keeping your financial information from the colleges while they're making decisions about your student's application and the price they will offer. In some cases, like the colleges that ask for a CSS profile, this is going to be difficult to do. But for the colleges that only ask for a FAFSA, you might find that it makes more sense to not provide them with your FAFSA information until after the admissions process is over, than in late May, for example, Complete the FAFSA so you have access to the federal student loans if you end up deciding that you want to use those funds. Here are some resources that you can use to answer all the questions that might come up as you complete the FAFSA or the CSS profile. Believe it or not, I mentioned this before, Federal Student Aid's YouTube channel has really impressed me. They have a whole bunch of short videos that answer the kinds of questions that come up, and it feels a lot less overwhelming. By contrast, the National College Attainment Network, also goes by NCAN, they have a site called the Better FAFSA, and it's a fantastic place to find every great resource about all aspects of the FAFSA. Now, it might feel overwhelming at first, but it will also be where you can find the resources that will answer those unique questions that are less likely to be asked by lots of people. Studentaid.gov, I wouldn't have recommended it a couple years ago, but it has improved a lot over the last few years. So don't be afraid to dig around on that site and look at their FAQ. Lastly, for the CSS profile, that form actually includes a really specific and really clear instructions throughout, even though it's a longer form. If you follow exactly the steps that they tell you to do on that site, you'll find that the profile isn't as bad as most folks think it is. And if you want some guidance from folks other than the ones that run the CSS profile, I would suggest going to a site run by the folks at MIFA, which stands for Massachusetts Educational Financial Authority, and look at their CSS profile support. Okay. I've given you a ton of information, and I'm sure you have all kinds of questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we will try to tackle as many questions as you have. Just go ahead and add your questions to the chat. I'm sure that there's plenty of folks who are wondering a little bit about the FAFSA or wondering a little bit about some element of the CSS profile. There's been a number of changes to the FAFSA, and many of those changes are what's taking so long. And so here's a great first question. Does the FAFSA take into account where you live? Unfortunately, no, it doesn't. The FAFSA formula doesn't pay any attention to where you live or how much it costs where you live compared to somewhere else. And that makes it a real problem and makes it difficult to be a fair assessment of how much you'd be able to pay. That is one of the reasons why they changed some of the formula and they removed some of the ways that it was calculated in the past. If your student goes to community college for the first 2 years, when do we need to fill out the FAFSA? You are going to need to fill out the FAFSA starting at the end of December. The FAFSA should come out, and you should fill that out right away for every year that you're going to send a student to college, whether it's a community college or a four-year college. You want to access the student loans or see if you qualify for federal student aid. You're going to want to fill out the FAFSA, and you'll need to fill it out every year that your student's in college, because they recalculate whether you qualify for a Pell Grant. Some people qualify for a Pell Grant 1 year and don't the next, the other way around. It can vary. Okay, let's see a couple more really good questions here. Yes, this is going to be recorded. A question about financial assistance when you study abroad. Every institution organizes study abroad a little bit differently, and some schools will be able to apply your financial aid that you get at an American institution when you're studying in Japan or wherever it is you choose to go. But that's a very important question to ask the school, because it's very typical that they'll have a whole bunch of different study abroad programs. Some of them you can use the financial aid you got from that university and everywhere else, pay for that program, but others of them you might not. So it's very important to ask those questions. Okay. previous versions of the FAFSA. Small business question. This is a great question, and it dovetails with the question that came next about some of the changes in the FAFSA. So some of the changes in the FAFSA formula. It really is important to understand that the way that they rewrote the FAFSA, they sort of philosophically decided a couple of things. One is that it used to be that the thinking was the sort of norm was traditional student coming out of high school from a family whose the student is a dependent in every typical way. And so the family is sending that student off to college. And if the family has multiple kids in college, they're sending multiple kids and they still only have the same amount of money that they have. That was one of the assumptions. The other assumption was that they were trying to make the EFC, the expected family contribution, be something that actually represents what a family might have to pay for college. Both of those ideas are now gone. The FAFSA is now really focused on making sure that all the students that qualify for a Pell Grant will get some Pell Grant money. And the rest of everybody else, the student aid index is no longer meant to indicate the amount of money that a family should pay to go to college or should have to pay to send their kid to college. The student aid index is now just an index where the only usefulness of that number is sort of by comparing student to another student to another student. One student has a higher number than a lower number. That would suggest that one student might be in a little bit better financial situation than another. But that number from the SAI, the student aid index, is not an indication of how much money that family should be able to pay for college. Anybody who's been around this block for a while knows that the EFC was never a good indicator of what people could pay. It was always a problem. They've now thrown that idea out entirely. That means that, to your question about small businesses, now the small business is included in calculating the SAI. So there is a question here that no one's really answered, which is, how would you value that business? The federal government hasn't said, so that's a whole nother can of worms. But yes, now the small businesses and farms, if you have a farm, those are now included in your SAI. One of the other questions that someone has put in here is, how does having a rental property affect the FAFSA and how much financial aid would be given? Do they go based on the property value or profit or rental property? There isn't a clear answer on valuing that property. Some schools actually like to go to Zillow and say, well, what does that property value based on Zillow? That's crazy. You should go to what the county records you should use that document, the information that comes from taxes, before you go to Zillow. But yes, if you have additional property beside your primary residence, those are assets that you will have to count in your filling out the FAFSA, and that will affect your SAI. Now, it's important to understand that the formula now for the FAFSA, if the family's income is $60,000 or less, then the assets don't matter. The student's going to qualify at least for a minimum Pell. All right. Fall 2024, college student reported 22 adjusted gross income. And okay, how can I get information on? I'm trying to make sure Jackie, I'm trying to make sure I read this correctly. Fall 2024, college students have to report their 2022 adjusted gross income. Yep. And in much less, okay, great question. When you're completing the FAFSA as a senior or the family with a senior, and those of you who have students who are juniors, sophomores, you can't fill out the FAFSA now even if you really wanted to. That's why you can use an estimator instead to get a sense of what your results would be. But the FAFSA is only for people who are sending students to start college next fall. When you're filling out the FAFSA, you're using a tax return from the 2022 year. And as one person mentioned here, happens to a lot of folks, especially over the last 5 years, your financial situation has changed dramatically between the 2022 tax returns and what life is like now. That is where you're going to make sure you pull together all your records to demonstrate that. And you are going to then have those records and bring those to the college that you choose to go to that has accepted you and say, yes, the FAFSA results say one thing, but things have changed dramatically, and you need to know that and account for that in how you award the student. The federal government's, because of the new FAFSA changes, they have said repeatedly now to colleges and universities, we want you to take advantage of this notion of special circumstances and professional judgment, because we know that there's this 2-year gap. And especially this year, because everyone's working with a new formula they haven't seen before. So lots of people have this situation where their financial situation has changed dramatically from the taxes that they use to fill out the FAFSA. Get all those records together and just be ready to go to every school that you want to, that are sort of finalists, and explain to them those circumstantial changes, because they should recognize that and they should take that into account. Do I recommend middle-income families delaying completing the FAFSA until after acceptances come in? I wouldn't delay it just on its own. I would first fill out a FAFSA estimator, go to the FAFSA site and do their financial aid estimator and find out what it's going to look like for you. You might be a middle-income family that still qualifies for some small amount of, say, a subsidized loan or some other kind of need. And you might qualify for something on a state level. I know in California, there's the middle class grant that is for people who don't qualify for a Pell Grant. And there's only so much money available there. So you wouldn't want to wait and miss out on that scholarship at the state level because you didn't do a FAFSA. Now, if you know, however, that you won't qualify for any of that, state or federal, then if you are applying to colleges that still take need into account when they put together scholarship awards, then there might be a logic to say, wait and hold the FAFSA information, don't fill it out until after you get accepted and you get a price. But that's a conversation that you really need to have in more detail with your counselor, and just to think through that strategy. Another question. I mentioned that employer tuition reimbursement program. This is for parents' employers, not student employment. Shauna, thank you for asking that question, because it's both. There are programs at different employers where the tuition reimbursement program actually can apply to anybody in your immediate family. And there are others where it's specifically for the student. When I was talking about it earlier in the presentation, I was thinking primarily for the student. Student goes and gets a job at Home Depot, for example, and then takes classes part-time or even 3/4 time while they're working at Home Depot, and they're knocking off college credits while they're getting paid, and they're not having to pay a dime for going to college. There are, however, some examples of tuition reimbursement programs that can be applied to a student. There's criteria there that would be very specific in terms of where you could take those classes and a whole bunch of other things, but those exist. Okay, we have gotten right to time here, 9 o'clock, and I think we've gotten to a pause in the process of the questions. Oh, there was one more question. I'm going to answer one more question before we end this. Somebody asked, How do I apply for merit scholarships and aid? It's a great question. At most colleges that give out merit aid, you don't have to do anything extra. You just apply to that college and go through the application process, and they will consider you for merit aid, some of their, especially their larger merit aid scholarships, just as a function of you having applied there. Sometimes they do have some larger scholarships or more specialized scholarships that have earlier deadlines, and those will all be on those schools' websites. Really the last question. All right. Do you think change from the EFC to the SAI is beneficial to middle income families? It's certainly different. If you're trying to go to a school that awards primarily based on need, and they're using the FAFSA, then no. If they're a school that's using the CSS profile, which most of the schools that award based on need are doing anyway, then it's sort of irrelevant. But for schools that only use the FAFSA, that award based on need, for middle income families, this shift wasn't very helpful. So, all right, sorry to end on a downer. Lindsay, thanks for putting this in the chat. Yes, we will have the second of this series of 5 webinars on January 22nd. We'll be talking more generally about financial fit, how it's important, and how to think about coming up with what that financial fit should be. Thanks to everybody who joined tonight. Thanks for all the questions. Tons of great questions. Thanks again to our interpreters. I really appreciate your effort in Cantonese and Mandarin and in Spanish. Lindsay, is there anything that you want to add before we sign off?
No, I think that's good. Thank you.
Absolutely. It was really fun to be here with everybody, and have a great evening.